Hello, welcome. My name is Jean Seaton. I'm the director of the Orwell Foundation, and we've been having a festival of political writing, asking some quite difficult questions about Orwell and anti-Semitism and Orwell and Russia and things. And tonight we've got, we're very excited to have a panel on the future of public service broadcasting. I mean, we're in a very, very peculiar world at the moment in which, you know, things that previously might have looked like your capacity to understand certainty is dissolving in front of you. I don't know why this particular is. This is just an Orwell quote, which for some has been sticking in my head all week. Actually, I gave it to Liz as well. The present, said Orwell, gives one the feeling of our civilization going down in a mist of lies, where it will be impossible to find out the truth about anything. Even better, he said, one of the problems about the current thing is the constipated little cage of lies we live in, which is a very Orwell. There's a certain vivacity in that. We're very pleased to have this discussion because I think actually we've let software engineers re-engineer politics, society, everything, without asking them to do better. And I think that's a really big problem, and it's the problem that's everywhere. We're really pleased to have Jon Sopel. He really doesn't need an introduction. You've all spent your time watching him. He was a BBC correspondent on the politics shows, interviewed lots of prime ministers, BBC Global. He's written books from when he was in America, and now he's got a really rather kind of good, whether he feels
rather kind of.
Sorry.
Kind of.
A podcast called
good.
The News Agents, but he was talking about how different it was working for outside the BBC. We've got Sophie Chalk, the policy analyst and engine, really, of the voice of the listener and viewer. What Sophie doesn't know is that I have all of the papers of Jocelyn Hay in my office at work. And they have been in my office at work now for several years, certainly since before the pandemic. And every so often a student has to sort of work their way around them. And Steve Barnett and I, who share the office, occasionally say we must do something about Jocelyn Hay's papers, but if we hadn't taken them in, they would have been thrown away. So the voice of the listener and viewers, I think lots of you here will know this, is a really important and interesting organisation which has become a really useful voice of citizens, frankly, a useful sort of place where you can go to for where the citizens' interest, which is not something that plays a large part, frankly, in some of our debates about the future of broadcasting. So she's been a real engine. She's originally a producer, but she's been a real engine of, I think, of a kind of policy analysis, and we need more of that. I'm afraid policy is very boring, but it's most important. We've got Kevin Brennan, the MP for Cardiff West since 2001. His main claim to fame is that he taught Carol Cadwallader.
That's true.
Who speaks very warmly of his capacity to actually find the really bright teenager and bring her on. He also, I feel very close to this. I have a very close friend who's worked in prisons for years and years and years, running reading groups. He also got prisoners being allowed to have guitars, which is one of those things that actually, about humanity towards prisoners, when we've got so many of them, and things that actually help, seems to me really important. But he's done lots of great stuff of the kind we just expect our MPs to do, like save people's pensions. You know, we just take that for granted. So he's a politician, but he's also held several positions. But I think it's as the member of the DCMS Select Committee. In itself, select committees were actually more or less invented by a mixture of Sir Bernard Crick, our own founder, in the 1950s, coming back from America, and they've become a really powerful bit of democratic holding to account, and the DCMS Select Committee has been absolutely riveting and has been on the whole asking the right questions. So we're very grateful for all of you, and we're very grateful to them. Jon, I wanted to come to you first. You were the BBC's correspondent in America. You were there, I remember I was watching in Rome on January the 6th. I sort of in a kind of total panic. I have lots of American relations. So the sight of the kind of founding big democracy around the place collapsing. Do you think that the fact that we haven't totally collapsed is anything to do with the fact that we've got relatively reliable public service broadcasting? How much did I don't want to say disinformation, but how much did the corruption of the information sphere in America lead to January the 6th? I mean, many other things did as well.
Many other things did as well. And lovely to be here, and thank you very much indeed for inviting me. And Jean, it's great to be on this panel. January the 6th was extraordinary. Trump made this speech at what's called the Ellipse, which is just beyond the south lawn of the White House. I went down to it, and I've been to loads of Trump rallies. And the atmosphere at this one was so different from everything I'd ever done before. Actually, Trump rallies are really good, could be really good fun, and they were rather joyous, and people dress up and all the rest of it. And this, you could just sense there was a mood of ugliness, because for weeks since the election in November, Trump had been telling everybody that the election was stolen, that he won the election, that there was falsehood and lies and all the rest of it. And there were US networks who were willing to regurgitate that unchecked. Fox News, One American News Network, Newsmax. And they had a sizable chunk of the Republican base. And these are people who don't watch news to be informed, but watch news to be affirmed. Just please confirm what oh yeah, I'm right, it was stolen in the election. And these people were just listening to those outlets which would spew out. We know it's now cost Fox News $787 million so far, with the settlement with the Dominion voting machines, when they suggested that somehow the voting machines had been rigged, and even Hugo Chavez, who was long dead, had been involved in the rigging of those machines. And it just got more and more outlandish, and this was given as fact. And in US news, there is no regulatory framework of what you have to do, what you can say, what is beyond the bounds. And so you have these networks that have people, and it is their sole source of news. And for all the problems that we have in the UK, and my God, I could list them, and how crap certain things are, and you know, the strikes that we've had, and all the rest of it, we still have the rule of law, we still have free and fair elections. And I went on the 10 o'clock news that night, on January the 6th, so it was only 5 o'clock in the afternoon in Washington. The mob was still in control of Congress. Joe Biden's victory had not been certified. And I said on air, and words that I never thought would come from my mouth when I was the BBC's North America editor, was US democracy is fragile, and this is a fragile moment. And if we care about our democracy, which I do, we can't take it for granted, and we need to fight against that. And actually, I think our broadcasting space in the UK, with Sky, with the BBC, with ITV, actually does a really good job of trying to regulate that space so that people can trust, sort of, pretty much, that they're getting good information.
Sophie, I mean, the argument, so if you look at what's happened to the public service broadcasting terrain over the last year, I noticed that Nick Robertson did a rather interesting piece in the Press Gazette, actually, in which he said, you know, behind our backs, really, there's been it's a bit like in 2001, you know, the system we thought we had has been dismantled to some extent, so that impartial news is now much more challenged and more difficult. When you look at it from the VLV, an independent charity, how do you see where we are in that trajectory towards America?
We're certainly aware of concerns about the foxification, as it's being called, of British news. And it does seem that the predictions that infotainment, so infotainment as opposed to news, would sort of become the norm. I think that those are coming to pass, and I think some TV channels, GB News, Talk TV, are pushing at the regulatory envelope, let's say, in terms of impartiality and what is allowed. I think they're testing it, and I think the government was quite keen that we should have a wider range of views on television, certainly, and so I think Ofcom. Well, there have been suggestions that Ofcom regulation of impartiality has been relaxed. They've moved the goalposts. And Ofcom are now looking at whether sitting MPs should be allowed to present programmes, or audience expectations of MPs presenting programmes and what the audience wants. Ofcom decides whether a programme has to be duly impartial. Not Parliament, not the legislation. It's Ofcom decides that. And so they have these weird distinctions. Weekly discussion programmes on whichever channel, whether it's called a news channel or not, those don't have to be duly impartial, but daily magazine programmes do. So that means that Nadine Dorries can interview Boris Johnson, and that is considered duly impartial. Well, it's considered, it's allowed. It's just not. They're not worried about it. Whereas, if you have a daily magazine programme on GB News, that can't be presented by an MP. And that some of the decisions that Ofcom have made in defining what should be covered and what shouldn't by due impartiality seem quite erratic to us. So I think we want that. We've got a media bill that's a draft media bill that's been published. We actually want the government to revisit impartiality regulation and the definition of news and what should be covered by impartiality regulation in this bill. It's not in there at the moment, but we would like to see that happen, because I think the reason that Ofcom is in a mess, and I think Ofcom is in a bit of a mess about this, I think it's really struggling to work out how to cope with Jacob Rees-Mogg and Nadine Dorries and other sitting MPs presenting programmes and interviewing their colleagues, secretaries of state and ministers on their programmes, and Ofcom doesn't really know what to do about it. And I think Ofcom's in a very difficult position, actually. I have some sympathy, because they just don't know what to do. They don't know how to cope with this. So we need to look at it again, because impartiality regulation should actually help citizens trust broadcasting and help citizens understand what's going on in the world in a balanced way. And at the moment, I don't think it's effective. I just don't think that, well, we know that citizens' trust in broadcasting in the UK and around the world has declined significantly in recent years, according to the Edelman Trust Barometer. So we have a problem with trust. We need to do all we can to reinvigorate trust in broadcasting.
Kevin, there was a 2014 blog that Dominic Cummings wrote, which I can't quote accurately, but anyway, in which he says, there are three things we've got to do, one of which is have a new right wing on broadcasting, get rid of the BBC, secondly, get rid of the BBC, and thirdly, get political advertising, actually, pay political advertising. And it was, presumably that from where you've been sitting in Parliament all the way through, what looked like the trajectory.
Well,
was that just a fantasy of Mr. Cummings?
No, I don't think it was. First of all, thank you very much again for inviting me to this. And it is the name of Orwell really that's very attractive to come along to something like this. And as a sixth former, I read as part of my A-level English the essays of George Orwell, and I think probably those writings probably have more influence on me, than possibly anything before or since. And I was just looking again back today at Politics in the English Language, the seminal essay by him, which I realised I did a Prime Minister's Questions today, and it was, I think, 37 words. Most people use more than 37 words, and I realised it's absolutely, Orwell's sort of admonition to people to make sure that they cut it down to the words that you actually need to use, rather than, and at that point I better stop talking about that because I've used it. But no, I think that was very much on the cards in 2019. when the government won a majority at the sort of Boris Johnson post-Brexit December awful election, if you're trying to knock doors in the middle of December. I decided deliberately after 15 years on the Labour front bench, both in and out of government, to go onto the back benches and try and join the digital, as it was then, Culture, Media and Sport Select Committee, because I thought possibly I might be able to, do more good there than just, being on the opposition front bench. And secondly, quite frankly, because I thought that Dominic Cummings and Boris Johnson's agenda was to destroy the BBC in this Parliament. And I told the then chair of the Select Committee, when I joined, when he asked to talk to me, that if you are part of that agenda, you're going to have to come through me, because, on this Select Committee, and he assured me he wasn't. And in fairness, I think that ended up being the truth. But the government wanted to appoint Charles Moore as chair of the BBC. They made that clear by leaking his name frequently, in the press, even though he's utterly unsuitable as someone who refused to pay his licence fee on a number of occasions, and also had done various racist writings over the years that would make him completely unsuitable for the job. And, I think the Select Committee played its part in preventing that from happening. It wasn't just us, but there was the vigorous opposition to that. So I think, had that government, Boris Johnson be able to have his way and Dominic Cummings be able to have their way, we wouldn't be in a position now where the BBC, it's been weakened by budget cuts, there's been a chilling effect, no doubt, of the government's partial politicisation of some of the running of the BBC. But it is still a strong and extremely important institution, as I would say are our other public service broadcasters, Channel 4, ITV, Channel 5 News is their news they've got a good news programme. It's different. Their viewing figures, I think, have gone up 20% in the last year since they've ironically been taken over by Paramount and sort of significantly improved the quality of their news gathering. So, but there are massive existential and political challenges ahead for public service broadcasters in this new world of streaming, in this world of GB News and Talk TV and the infotainment kind of approach, where Ofcom don't even consider, even though they call themselves GB News, they don't even consider what they do news for most of it, hence the no need for the impartiality. So all of this is very important. We've got this draft media bill, which is in front of our Select Committee for pre-legislative scrutiny, which lots more could be included in it, as we've heard, but which has some positive things in it, which is an attempt to try to maintain the prominence of public service broadcasters in this new world of streaming, where no longer are lots of people, particularly as many people in this audience will know, under the age of 30 in particular, are no longer accessing television and news via traditional linear channels and the electronic programming guide, but through all sorts of other ways. So if we believe in public service broadcasting, we believe it has value, I think it has value more than ever in the world we live in at the moment, then we mustn't allow it to be locked away in a cupboard where people can't find it. It has to be presented to people when they are using whatever selection method they use to access news and information. So that's really the challenge that we all face.
What about the argument which comes from America, which we hear the whole time, which is that now, and actually students say it to you, actually, they say, I can get everything I want, there is so much variety, and that sort of merges into a pathetic version of freedom of speech, as sort of, as it were, Miltonian, as opposed to John Stuart Mill's freedom of speech. What about that argument, and how would one seek to bolster, so there's the bolster the work that and the reach, actually, and the imagination of the public service broadcasters? It seems to me that they've been in chains in various ways. John, what would you do, having left, but not just the public service?
No. I loved my time at the BBC. It was a great honour, and I did some fabulous jobs at the BBC. So I kind of look back at it. I was struck by all the time that I was in Washington, which was through the Trump years. I felt I had the latitude and the permission, if you like, to call out lies and untruths from Donald Trump and could be very bold in what I said on the 10 o'clock news. I'm not sure that Laura Kunsberg, who was at Westminster, she was the political editor, I was the Washington editor. There was no chance that Donald Trump was going to ring up Tim Davie and say, what has Jon Sopel just said? He might call me a beauty at a news conference, which he did, and we fell out and he shouted at me a few times. But that was going to be it. Whereas, if Laura had strayed 5 degrees east or 5 degrees west, then there was a chance that either the leader of the opposition or the Prime Minister would be on to Tim Davie and say, what the hell has she just said? And I think that when we think about impartiality, and I've thought about this a lot because of what happened in America, there are all sorts of ways to skin that cat. But one of the things that I think is chilling is when within an organisation like the BBC or anywhere else, where you think, I mustn't say anything provocative.
Yeah.
I think we've got to, if a politician has told a lie, I think it is we don't willy-nilly go on the air and say he's a bloody liar, because I think that would be very alienating. But if we have got the evidence before us that this is a lie, why don't we just say it? And it was kind of struck me listening to Chris Mason a couple of days ago, after Boris Johnson had reacted to the Privileges Committee. He said he has lied. Mm-hmm. We sort of knew that for a kind of little while and did not say that. And this is not a party political point, this is not, but if we care about government and process and parliamentary democracy, which, as I said in my introductory remarks, I think that is key to us living in a free society, then we have to call this stuff out. And we can't do, the Tories say this, Labour say that, only time will tell, Jon Sopel, BBC News Westminster. Because I think that is pusillanimous, and I think it's weak. And I think that we have got to be really careful before we go on air, that we have got our facts sorted, that we have made the necessary checks, that we are going to use language with care and precision. But once we've done that, we say it. And I think that there has to be a boldness, because I think that the point you made, Jean, about young people going elsewhere, and the thing that struck me, I started doing a podcast when I was in America with Emily called Americast, which is still going on the BBC now, is that I was coming back to the UK and young people were stopping me and saying, I listened to your podcast. Young people never stopped to say they heard me on the Today programme or they heard me on the 10 o'clock news, because that was a pursuit for people over 60. And so I think that the BBC and public service broadcasters generally have to look at how they engage a wider audience, because that will give them legitimacy. But having a very timid definition of what impartiality is will get them nowhere.
There's a wonderful thing you did, which is, I think you were in Australia and you said, the 2 plus 2, the BBC shouldn't go on and say 2 plus 2 equals 6 sometimes.
Well, I said that it's not, there are some people, it would be easy to say 2 plus, some people say 2 plus 2 is 4. Yeah. Some people say 2 plus 2 is 6.
But 2 plus 2.
Well, only time will tell. No, 2 plus 2 is 4. And I think we've got to be able to say that.
Although I listened to a Radio 4 programme this week that said about mathematics, that said 1 plus 1
is not always 2.
I did.
Oh, yeah.
Exactly.
Really
that would have hurt my head. I'm glad I missed that.
But it was mathematicions.
It was mathematicians.
It was very sophisticated. I could see that the nature of 1 as an object was more beyond me. Sophie, can I just come to, regulation always feels like a sort of complicated subject, as it were, and it looks as if it's a long way away from people being offered stuff. Why does regulation matter, and what would make Ofcom, what do you need to do? Ofcom was seen as a gold standard regulator, actually. It wasn't captured by the industry. Do we now think it is entirely captured by the industry? The commercial industry. That's
I don't know, as a citizen, as an organisation that tries to represent citizens' interests, we're up against some quite well-funded teams out there who are lobbying. So one of our complaints, but this applies to the BBC and its consultation processes, which are pretty thin now, Ofcom, DCMS, everybody really, in terms of listening to citizens and thinking about what citizens might want and need. And we can't possibly say that we represent all citizens. We don't.
Yeah.
But we try to look at what the societal benefits might be of having a high quality, accurate, well-funded broadcasting system with a plural range of voices that sort of hits various targets, let's say, in terms of providing content that is broadens people's horizons, educates them,
Yeah.
but it doesn't all have to be high fibre. It can be, so looking at that and trying to submit evidence to Ofcom and the government is quite challenging sometimes when you're up against really well-resourced corporations. And they have whole teams, and I work part-time for VLV, and so it's me versus the rest of them, sometimes it feels like, which is, that's what it feels like. I don't think Ofcom's bad. I think there are some amazingly talented, interesting people in Ofcom who have huge integrity, and I really enjoy working with them. There was a suggestion at a recent conference that we ran that Ofcom has shifted the goalpost on impartiality regulation without really announcing that it's done so, because the government wanted to have a wider range of voices on TV. Whether that's the case or not, I don't know, but there was an Ofcom representative there who staunchly defended himself. But it's hard to say, isn't it? Whether I don't think the industry's necessarily captured Ofcom. Ofcom's under pressure from industry. It's under pressure from government. It's under pressure from us. Hopefully, if we're doing a good job, and then it has to make decisions that are sensible. And regulation per se. I mean, I always sort of say I do this job, and it sounds terribly boring, but actually, I've become completely obsessed with it over the period of the last sort of 20 years I've been doing it, and I'm fascinated by it, which obviously means I've been completely captured by policy. and I think it's absolutely fascinating. How do you make it work? It's very complicated. There's no one right answer, which is why the select committee is looking into this media bill. There won't be one right answer to all the challenges we face, but I think to discuss it properly and have accountable organisations look at it and for citizens to be at the heart of it at the end of the day. I mean, what's the point? I mean, there is a commercial point. I mean, that's what we're facing actually, is the world has increasingly become commercial, and there's nothing wrong with commercial per se. If people want to watch programmes that are considered very popular, that's great, but we also want other stuff that it isn't just commercially motivated.
Well,
that shouldn't be the only driving factor.
No. And also there's a fallacious argument about variety, which it always sounds as if there's more variety if it's commercial, but in fact commercial tends to absolutely exclude a whole range of voices and interests that public service broadcasting is there to serve. So that it's a fallacious argument that wins half the thing. But one of the things is that public service broadcasting has been a very smart intervention into one of our biggest industries, which has jobs all over the country. One of the really interesting things during the Channel 4 consultation was discovering how, or at least trying to alert Conservative MPs to the fact that there was bound to be a Channel 4 related company in the street down from their office, and you could really do it. As Labour comes in looking to make smart investment, how does it see an industry which also involves our creativity, our stories, our sense of ourselves?
I represent Cardiff. I'm from South Wales. We've gone from manufacturing widgets and digging coal to manufacturing fantasies and making news. And that's the reality of the change in the economy where I am. The creative industries and the media industries, the new BBC headquarters. If you visit Cardiff, you get straight off the train. There it is, right in front of you, next to our wonderful stadium. It's a hugely important, actually, employer and part of the economy, and the fastest growing part of the economy right across the UK, and particularly in the areas where I represent. And making people understand the economic importance of all of this, leave aside the cultural and political importance that we're talking about, is really, very, very significant. And the Channel 4 privatisation argument is an interesting case in point. You would have thought that the Conservative government would actually cherish an institution created by Mrs. Thatcher that costs no public money whatsoever, even though it's a public service broadcaster. It completely makes its own money. It isn't allowed to become a sort of centralised behemoth. It's supposed to. All its programming is made by small production companies all around the UK, as you quite rightly point out. And yet yet again, it's the second time I've been involved in fighting this off in 5 years. That yet again they find this solution in search of a problem. That they want to privatise it and then take away Channel 4's ability to do the unique things it does within the public service broadcasting space. Have to serve shareholders and give away this, they make any surplus they make to give that away to shareholders, and inevitably, reduce the amount of, the quality of the program making that they can make. Now there is an argument you can get more investment. There's an argument about the new thing, but actually, what we really need is not a copy of another American kind of media company. We need unique entities within this wonderful concept, I think, of public service broadcasting, that there is, that will enable us not to just become yet another American-style media environment, but that we have something ourselves that's unique, that doesn't just show American programs and repeats and all that sort of thing. So I think there's huge value still in the concept of public service broadcasting, even though it's evolving into something that some people call public service media because of the changes in the way that people consume content.
And I guess I'm an example of that in the sense that after we recorded our podcast today, I sat in the studio and recorded commercials for the sponsors, of our podcast, because it's got to be paid for and it's a commercial thing. And yet, I don't think we compromise on quality. We've got a lot of blue chip companies coming in. We've got a huge number. So I think that commercialization, or the commercial aspect of this, is not necessarily a bad thing. The other interesting thing is that the company that makes the podcast I work for is global, and they own LBC, Capital Radio, XFM. I'm going to miss out half of them, Heart FM, and a number of others. But at LBC, their schedule, they don't have a Today programme. They have Nick Ferrari, who's robust, tabloid past, kind of let's say just a few centimetres to the right of centre. Some would say more. And then he's followed by James O'Brien, who is absolutely firmly a Remainer, very harsh on the Tories. And the really interesting thing from their audience figures is that it's not that the whole audience switches off at 9 o'clock or 10 o'clock when James takes over and a whole new audience tunes in. There is a huge crossover. And I kind of think that is healthy. Yeah. So I don't mind opinion. Yeah. As long as you're getting balance across the day. The Foxification argument does frighten me, because of the idea that you're going to... And CNN in America was just as bad, and so was MSNBC on the left, just calling... There was no fair coverage of Trump at all. And it was just so, you monetized anti-Trump sentiment on the left, as well as Fox monetized pro-Trump sentiment on the right. And so I just think there are ways of doing it that just don't go beyond, that go beyond the conventional model of a rule of impartiality of and how...
I agree with that, John, very, very strongly, but I also think that what's really important in the structure we have, and lots of people in the private sector say this to me as well, is that because we've got that public service broadcasting framework, it exercises a kind of positive gravitational pull all around in relation to media standards and so on. And there is an undermining of that going on, I believe, potentially with services like GB News and Talk TV, which has been allowed to become a kind of succubus on the electronic programming guide by occupying the local TV channel. Yeah, Jeremy Hunt's stupid idea that you can have these local television channels like America and so on, which mainly run repeats of all sorts of things and have 5 minutes of local news now and again. But suddenly I turn on my TV in Cardiff and it says made in Cardiff, but what's on there? Talk TV, hour after hour in the day at channel 7 or whatever it is on the electronic programming guide, where it's just supposed to be reserved for public service broadcasting prominence. So I think you know, Ofcom, I think, is a very good regulator. I think the problem, in my view, at the moment, is the leadership isn't strong enough in Ofcom, and we need to, you know, strengthen it and give it the confidence to do what it ought to be doing to preserve that positive gravitational pull.
I mean, I think it's very interesting that John says that, because you and Emily, in a sense, were formed and forged in a straightforward public service pot. And indeed, of course, during the American elections, the BBC became an absolute turn-to for both the right and the left, because they didn't trust anything that was going on at home. So there is a separate issue, really, about you know, how we play ourselves in our much diminished role into a world audience where the you know, journalism is under pressure absolutely everywhere, and yet and is really under, you know, journalists are being arrested, media houses are being taken over, authoritarianism is on the march. So there is also a kind of really interesting aspect of our public service broadcasting which you get in the BBC World Service, which is actually one of the only places where people can go to still, actually quite often across contested borders. If you speak Urdu in India or Pakistan, you go to. Sophie, I want to just come to this last thing about the bill. There's this bill going through. Why should everybody pay attention to it? And what are the cultures that seem to be forming it, particularly in the DCMS? Are we looking at a culture that doesn't understand the golden bowl that it's carrying?
I don't know. I think there's a big question as to whether the bill will actually become an act before we have a general election. So, and there are those in the industry who will be very disappointed if it doesn't go through, because there are some provisions in the bill that are really important, as you were saying, about prominence for public service content, and that's really overdue, that provision. A regulation of streaming video on demand content, so on Netflix and Prime and such like, they will be subject to a code similar to the broadcasting code, so that, for example, they will have to make sure that content on their platforms, factual content, is accurate. And I think, you know, we're really concerned about fake news, misinformation, disinformation. So that's a really good step forward, that video content, streamed video content on those platforms will need to be accurate. And if not, then you'll have the right to complain to Ofcom, and Ofcom will have to deal with it in the same way they do other broadcasters. So that's a good thing. So there are some really good things in there, but there are some problems, we think. And so I don't want to get too technical, but there's something called the PSB remit, which is in the current Communications Act, which specifies that we should have genre like religion and sports and arts programming and matters of international significance. So these are all sort of mind-opening, educational genre. They're the kind of broccoli, aren't they? The broccoli and the spinach of broadcasting. And I don't think I worked in as a producer-director in made factual programs and worked in news as well. And one of my things I felt really passionate about is that actually broccoli doesn't have to be boring. You can make a cookery program set in Colombia, which I did, and we nearly got kidnapped in the process in a community.
Broccoli.
You know, so spicy broccoli. So you can make broccoli spicy. So that should be that. I think that, you know, it doesn't have to be high fibre, doesn't have to be boring. So you can make really imaginative programs that are high fibre, but they're actually quite accessible. That type of content, which is currently demanded by the Communications Act, but has never really been properly enforced because Ofcom didn't have the teeth to enforce it. It's there though, and I think it being there is really important, because I think we want Parliament to decide how to describe public service broadcasting. We want that to go through Parliament. We want parliamentarians to say, this is what we think the definition of public service broadcasting should be, rather than the broadcasters decide or Ofcom decide. We think it's something that's really important to democracy, that government, and you can go to your MP then and say, this is what I want from public service broadcasting. What do citizens want from public service broadcasting? There's some accountability there if constituents can go to their MPs and say, I want this type of content to remain. The DCMS, I had a meeting with them recently, and I don't want to speak out of turn, but I was really shocked because they said, we don't really need any of that stuff anymore. because you can get it on YouTube. And they said, the Church of England's got a YouTube channel. So if you want religious content, you can just get it there. And I didn't quite know what to say. The first thing I said, but that's not regulated for accuracy. And also it's not universal, which is one of the fundamental principles of public service broadcasting, is that you buy a TV set, you have a TV aerial, and once you've got the kit, you don't pay anything extra for it beyond the TV license, which I know that's controversial in itself with some people, but you pay your TV license and then it's free. In order to watch YouTube, you have to have internet connection, you have to have broadband. 6% of households in the country don't have access to broadband or don't choose to pay for broadband. So it's not universal, it's not regulated for accuracy. And if you look at the Church of England's YouTube channel, which I then did, it's mostly sermons. So if you want to see the Archbishop of Canterbury speaking, then you're going to get quite a lot of that. You're not going to get much about Islam, virtually nothing about Islam actually on the Church of England YouTube channel, which isn't a surprise to me. So you're not going to, and you're not going to have any there are no documentaries, there's no journalism, there's no investigations. If you're looking at Orwell, his passion for really finding the truth and making sure that people are held to account, there's none of that. So I think the DCMS don't understand what they're doing. I think they've just cancelled a whole load of genre on TV. And I'm still reeling, and I had that conversation this week, and I'm really worried. So actually, I think that it's down to parliamentarians now. The parliamentarians are the only ones who can stop this from happening, and I think we need them to stop it from happening.
Kevin, can I just say, poor people, rich people have always going to get access to really good information because they need it and they use it, but poor people aren't, and that feels to me like a Labour agenda.
Yes, I mean, look, it is true that there's a lot of information that's available, on the internet and lots of websites and so on. But what we're talking about here, is something you can go to that's got a actual kite mark or whatever you want to call it that tells you what you're getting here is news and information that has been checked and met at standard. And of course, currently, I think it is the government's position currently that linear broadcasting will be switched off in 2034. And there are still going to be millions of people, in my view, often people who are older, often people who are economically not in a strong position and therefore don't have lots of subscriptions to different services or may not even have access to very smart televisions and so on, that will still be relying on linear broadcast, as we've seen with radio and the switch over from radio over the years, at that time. So I do think it is a Labour agenda, and I do think that I'm not on the front bench now, but I do very strongly feel that as we go into the next election, we should lean very strongly into having a clear vision for the future of public service broadcasting.
Thank you. I just want to ask John just one last thing, and then I'll let you talk, which is to end on the BBC. The BBC is an institution. And institutions are quite valuable things. They're very, very difficult to build and very easy to lose. In what sense? And did you feel by the end that the BBC is an institution which should give it some power, actually, some independence? As you left, were you worried about that? This can all be reinvented, I have, in my view, but...
There were things at the edges that concerned me. I was in the US all through Brexit, and I came back. I did a trip with Obama, where I was on Air Force One. We flew from Saudi Arabia to London, and London to Germany, and then back to Washington. And I was on the plane with the president. And I did a piece for the news, for radio. And they said, "It's a nice piece, John, but it hasn't got any Nigel Farage in it." And I said, I thought, which was quite a witty remark, I don't think Nigel Farage was on Air Force One. And I was told that wasn't good enough because every piece had to be internally balanced. And I just thought, nah, that's not impartial journalism, that's cowardice. And that was an easy way out. And I thought we sort of let ourselves down a bit over that. And I could see at times that the pressure that was being put on by Johnson, withdrawing all ministers from appearing on programmes where there would be scrutiny, state programme. I mean, in that sense, the only thing I think, thank God for the pandemic, because it was awful.
They scampered back.
Well, they scampered back because they needed to, and they realised the value of the BBC. So I want to sit. I have my only interest is for the BBC to flourish and to be great, and to be confident and to be bold. And I sometimes think that among some people there is a view that, okay, if we do this, we'll get good coverage from the Daily Mail and the Daily Telegraph. And my own view, having left and kind of got out, is I think the Daily Mail and the Daily Telegraph are never going to love you. They're always going to find a reason to be critical. So you've got to do what you think is right and have the intellectual self-confidence to follow that and to give us bold, interesting, spicy broccoli, because we do have to do some of the broccoli in news coverage, but let's make it as engaging as possible. And you know, I kind of think that when I went on the television news and I was standing outside the White House, I thought, I've just got to tell people a story. Come, listen in, guys, because this is important. I want your attention because I think this really matters. And I think that, you know, we've just got to be bold in our storytelling so that we can, so that the audience thinks, oh, yeah, that does sort of matter.
Thank you very, very much. I think I'll open up the thing for discussion, for questions. And I'll take a couple of questions. One, two, if you just do a couple of questions.
Hi, this is kind of a question and a comment, really. I think public service broadcasting, by its very nature, is a serendipitous opportunity, and one which has curated abilities to open stuff up that people don't choose to go. We live in a podcast world where people go to certain things and they are in a kind of an echo chamber, I feel. I mean, I worked for many years on LBC producing radio drama, and we sustained a model for 15 years through sponsorship and Arts Council money. We dealt with National Public Radio and did classic series for them, but never new writing. In London, with some support, we premiered the work of Martin McDonagh and Simon Beaufoy. In the end, it was unsustainable. So the BBC, with public money, can sustain the most incredible creative engine, new talent, unperturbed by commercial pressure. I deal with Audible, and the only thing they seem to be interested in are well-known titles or huge novels. It's not about nurturing that talent for the future. So I suppose all I'm saying is I'm endorsing everything you've been saying, and I just hope that creative writing and audio drama forms a critical part of the national dialogue.
Thank you. Yes.
Hi, thank you all for your comments. I had a question mostly for John. I work at the U.S. Center on U.S. Politics here at UCL, so I'm curious, how do you think Trump can be covered fairly this next time around? I think you said it well that CNN was just as kind of off the rails as Fox was in some ways. They've tried to write it a little bit and have gotten skewered because of it. And journalists in the U.S. that I know are just freaked out about how to walk this line of impartiality, but also the sense of an ethical commitment to challenging Trump. So how would you recommend they do that here or there?
Wow, that's a big question. So look, in TV terms, what happened? I mean, go back to the 2016 election. You have a rally with Marco Rubio, little Marco. You have another rally that's about to take place with lying Ted Cruz. And you have another one with John Kasich, the Ohio governor. And you've got another one with someone else. And you've got one with Donald Trump. Which one do you take? You're going to take Donald Trump every time because there is jeopardy. There is risk. You don't know what he's going to say. You don't know what he's going to do. If I was the TV channels, right, we're going to change that. Donald Trump is not going to be ubiquitous on the airwaves all the time, every day. And I would push back on that. I also think that you just need some calm analysis of how he's doing what he's doing and why he's doing it. And I think you need to have the honesty to say, this is BS. I would not have held the CNN town hall in the way that they did it, because I don't, and CNN, it's been, you know, this is kind of real media sort of, but the CNN got a new boss. Zucker was out, this guy called Chris Licht came in, and they tried to go back to what they thought was sort of like central, kind of on the one hand, on the other journalism. And so they gave Trump a town hall full of Republican supporters of Trump. And the presenter, who I know well, absolutely got monstered by Trump. He was, it should have been a proper, disciplined, sit-down forensic interview, which weirdly has just happened on Fox News with Brett Baer. And Fox News, gave him a tough time. And I think you've got to be...
I think it was 760 million quid.
Yeah, exactly. And they're going to lose a whole lot more because there's another case coming. And so I think that you've got to be able to know what you're up against. And I think in 2016, people didn't. And in 2020, they were too forgiving. And it was so polarised. And I think that you've just got to have critical scrutiny of Trump in a way that we have not seen so far. And I think it might happen, because I think that, it looks like, I'm intrigued of what Fox, Fox has got seemingly right behind DeSantis, who is kind of, hopeless. Just as a political candidate, he seems so brittle and so unfriendly and so kind of tetchy, and has got very few people skills. What does Fox do if Trump does get the nomination? And also, it needs to be spelt out to the American people that they do face a choice. And for Donald Trump, this is about being back behind the Resolute desk or being in a prison cell. Because really, it is that serious, given what, the indictments in Miami last week.
It's an interesting concept, a town hall, where half the town isn't invited.
Yeah, exactly. And it was madness. It was madness. It was madness.
Can we just get back to that first point, which is just about the capacity of public service broadcasting to invest in new talent, where it seems to me, if you look at the industrial future of Britain, investing in new talent of every kind. Who would have known? We had Jesse Armstrong last week, who'd done Succession. Who would have known a nerd who was a political advisor to a Labour minister, who always really wanted to write about Murdoch, would come up with the most successul thing. Investing in new talent is about telling our own stories in new ways, and you never know.
And the fact, in defence of Sky, the fact that they're not a public service broadcaster, although because of some of the shenanigans around the takeover, which I was involved in a bit on the shadow front bench in sort of delaying and making sure they weren't just rebought by Rupert Murdoch without there being a competition. In the end, they all had to bid for how long Sky News would be, have to produce its sort of very high quality, good news service, in my opinion, and akin to a public service broadcaster. And the Succession is a Sky production, and they're doing some brilliant work, which is akin and of very high quality up there with public service broadcasters. But I go back to my point. I think that relates to the gravitational pull of what the structure we have of our system in this country. And then, but nurturing new talent, interesting case in point would be someone like Michaela Cole, who, wrote I May Destroy You. Well, of course, Netflix, I think, offered her $1 million or whatever it is for that series, but she turned it down because they wouldn't let her keep any of her own intellectual property, because their policy, although they denied it when I asked them about it, their policy basically is never to allow a creator to hang on to their IP,
The IP has been the channel for brilliance.
But with I May Destroy It, so therefore she went elsewhere to the BBC. So I think that role is very, very important in nurturing and having that pipeline and bringing that talent on.
I've got
just while you're bringing the microphone, I just want to answer one other thing about how to cover Donald Trump at the next election.
Yes, no, that we need this.
Calmly. Because I think that actually what happened was CNN decided that Donald Trump was the enemy and that they were the enemy to Donald Trump, and that legitimised a lot of Trump's attacks on the media, that we were the enemies of the people. So just be measured, calm, but absolutely critical of and fierce in our, but in a measured way. Sorry.
This is a question for Kevin Brennan, really. What will a future Labour government want from the BBC? Will it want it independent, or will it want it cowed? And if it's independent, how will it make sure it gets it?
Well, I very, very much hope it wanted to be independent, and that is the view of that all my colleagues that I speak to. Every politician gets, annoyed from time to time about coverage about them in the news and so on. And we do know the history, around the Iraq War and the Andrew Gilligan, controversy and all that, and Alistair Campbell's, reaction to all of that
Very
at the
big
time.
licence fee settlement just afterwards.
Well, we don't want to go over all of that ground, but there were faults on both sides, should we say, in that whole story. And I say that as somebody who voted against the war in Iraq back on March 18th, 2003. But the very much to, I think, restore that notion that the BBC has its editorial independence and that distance should be there, and you shouldn't have, prominent, still political Labour figures manipulating the appointments of people in the news department, in the BBC, and all those sorts of things, which I think are beginning potentially to creep into the structures, that have been going on in the last few years. And we haven't said much about it, but we do need to think about the licence fee. Absolutely. And what its future is in this new world. 2 years ago, our select committee did a report into the future of public service broadcasting, and we examined other models of how public service broadcasters are funded in other jurisdictions around the world, including America, which is a wholly different sort of thing with public television. It's just basically a begging bowl every so often. But in European countries as well, and what they've done. And basically all we said was that, of course, you can always challenge the notion of why should you have this poll tax, if you like, because it's a regressive tax. Why should you have this way of funding the BBC? But until someone comes up with an alternative that they can demonstrate is better and will work better than the licence fee, you can't continually undermine it and put and starve the BBC of the funding it needs to perform the role that it should have. I.e., if the government can't come up with an alternative, which they haven't been able to, then they should say for the next 10 years of the Charter, we're going to be still having the licence fee, because otherwise you're continually undermining and continually creating uncertainty about the future of public service broadcasting.
But this side needs a there.
Can I bring us back to impartiality just for a moment? I should say I'm Steve Barnett. I'm a colleague of Jean's.
We share the office with the VLV papers.
Exactly. John, in your podcast on Monday, you talked about the intimidation of the Privileges Committee members and said this is essentially a threat to democracy. I think what's happening with Ofcom and their latitude towards Talk TV and GB News is actually in the same category. Sophie was typically very diplomatic in talking about Ofcom. I have no doubt whatsoever that they are not carrying out their statutory duty under the Communications Act, that they are wrongly interpreting due impartiality. And a piece has just come out actually in the British Journalism Review explaining that. So my question really to all of you, particularly to you, Kevin, is a challenge. Is there something that you can do on the Select Committee, either through your pre-led scrutiny of the media bill, or simply by calling Ofcom in to say, you are not doing your job, this is dangerous, look what happened in 1986 when the fairness doctrine was abandoned in the US, and that gave us Fox News, and there is a direct line from there to the January the 6th insurrection. This could happen here. And I just wonder if that's something that you can do, you feel you could do, you would want to do, and where else can we make this pressure felt? And do you agree?
Well, I would. Do you want me to just answer that point? I would. Well, you may have already watched it, but I would recommend you watch the last time Melanie Dawes appeared in front of the Select Committee, where I think we did, explore, quite a lot of that territory, and it is of live interest to the committee. Shall I put it that way? And I think during the course of the scrutiny of the media bill, these issues are undoubtedly going to come up. And I said earlier on, my fear is that I believe that Ofcom has weak leadership at the moment, and that these things are creeping in such a way that it will be difficult, to turn that environment around. And we were talking about this earlier. Imagine what GB News will be like if Labour were to win the next general election. Yes. They'll be thinking, this is where we're going to make our money now, on being the Fox News of Britain when you've got a Labour government in place. So it's absolutely vital that we deal with it.
Can I just say that as far as I'm aware, there's nothing in the media bill that would give you the opportunity for this point to be raised. So you might want to. Anyway,
won't stop us raising.
Well, I can write a letter. I can certainly write a letter to the chair of the committee, giving her a briefing on this if you want, because we feel very strongly about it, and we want it to. This would be additional material. Is there anything missing from the media bill? We consider this is missing.
You can draft some amendments as long as they're in scope. So,
I'm Paddy Barwise from London Business School. A couple of points and then a question for the panel. First point is, we don't have to speculate about whether public service broadcasting matters because we do have evidence. And in particular, the Zurich University and Antwerp University 18-country comparative study, which is looking at the determinants of the public's resilience to online disinformation. And they found 7 factors, and having strong public broadcasting was one of the 7. So the Nordics and the Netherlands were sort of the best, the UK just behind them. Southern Europe, Eastern Europe, not so good. The US in a category of its own. Second point, as Steve has just said, the key year in America was 1987. Surprisingly few people know the point he mentioned en passant, which was in 1987, Reagan abolished the fairness doctrine, which required due impartiality, roughly, on network news. And it would not have been possible for Fox News and the right-wing shock jocks to exist if that hadn't happened. And part of the famous Cummings blog post from 2004 was the introduction of the UK Fox News. And GB News is not quite Fox News. So the question for the panel about Fox News is, my impression is that Rupert has actually given up on Trump, partly because of 6 January, but mainly because the Dominion voting case has been so expensive but also so embarrassing that the executives, the evidence which came out in court, that the executives and presenters knew that the big steal in 2020 was a lie, but they carried on repeating it because they didn't want to lose their audience. Am I being hopelessly naive and over-optimistic in believing that Rupert's given up on Trump, or do you think he has?
So yes, I mean, I think that with Murdoch, I mean, yes, it's cost a huge amount of money and it's going to cost a lot more. Tucker Carlson, who was their biggest asset, has gone. But it's doing a dance, isn't it? On the one hand, it knows there is legal jeopardy. And if they had won that Dominion voting case, oh my God, the implications for US media. Because then there is no requirement to tell the truth if you can assert the First Amendment, which is free speech. Then there is no need to worry about anything ever again, and they could just publish what they wanted. So it was very healthy that it cost that amount of money. On the other side, they know that that their viewers can migrate to Newsmax or One American News Network, and that will cost them dearly. I thought the disclosures in the Dominion voting system case were fascinating. The emails from presenters who seem much more worried about their share price. Yeah. And my God, we've got to stop the journalists from getting the truth out there because it's going to affect my shareholding really badly. And so that was one of the shocking things. And also the extent to which they knew, to use a very Joe Biden word, it was total baloney, what was being spouted by Donald Trump, and the fact that they had presenter after presenter prepared to give it free will, and the journalistic core of the newsroom could not stop them. And in fact, the only pressure was on the newsroom to please stop telling us what's really happened. We've got to get on with this narrative because that's what our audience wants to hear. And I love that we are having tonight, and I love the concern that is being expressed about what could happen here, because we're still, I think, thousands of miles away from an American broadcasting system or the hyperpolarization that exists in American society. But, you know, January the 6th is a wake-up call to everybody that you can take none of this for granted.
Okay. I've got two. I'm going to take this question on this side, because this side. Does anybody else want a question on this side? So can we take two quite quickly? And then I'll take one then, and then we'll finish. Yeah.
Thanks. John, you said there's a number of different ways to skin the cat of impartiality, and I'd like to dig into that just a little bit. I remember about probably 10 years ago having a conversation with some senior apparatchik in BBC News who'd been doing focus groups and said, you know, talking to young people, they don't like the BBC News because they don't know what the presenters think. And it seems that's a kind of big issue for impartiality. But people love fact checker. It's a kind of political version of Martin Lewis, and everybody believes it. And I just wonder if, when you say there are different ways of skinning that cat, if one of the ways of doing it is to have something which is in a way distanced from the broadcasters, but has a kind of authority in the way that fact checker has. I mean, that's a highly debatable point, but you made the point about different ways of skinning the cat.
I think
the bigger issue is the point about spicing the broccoli and the diversity and comprehensive nature of what broadcasters cover. And it's not just spicing broccoli, but how do you have a whole range of vegetables that are spiced, and that's the responsibility of public service media to ensure that there is a level of public interest in these issues which are not immediately apparently obviously of interest.
I just want to take this next question from the young man behind.
Thanks. Hi, Jack Gamble from Campaign for the Arts. We've spoken today a lot about the need for public service media, the benefits that it brings to societies all around the world and to our own, and also the challenges that we face to the future of it, be that from dilution of the definition of it in legislation or funding of our public service broadcasters. It is a really complex set of things we're talking about here, and yet at the same time we know that people do value at least the fruits of this public service media, even if they're not actively engaged in the debate about it that we want to have. So my question is, John, I was struck by you talking about going on the TV news and leaning forward and saying, please lean in, I've got a story to tell you about what's happening in America. It's quite complex, there's this context, but you need to know this because we need to be having a discussion. My question is, how can we start to tell a story about this, about all of this stuff, that means that more people are talking about public service broadcasting more often?
I think I'll just take that final question now and then we'll
Hello, John. David Loyne. I'm a
David,
former BBC correspondent and colleague of John's. Can I just question this point about calling out liars, which you appealed for journalists to do more of? And I had left the BBC by the time of the Brexit debate, and I remember that BBC News made a real effort to look into the £350 million for the NHS on the side of the bus, and it didn't make a blind bit of difference. In fact, I think the more often they said this figure's wrong, they only ended up repeating the 350 million for the audience who were still listening. And the Washington Post were counting during the Trump presidency the lies, and I can't remember the total, but it was X thousand, and it's several a day. And Trump and Johnson are the same kind of politician. They both just layer it, lie on lie on lie on lie on lie. So journalists get the normal process of journalism and calling things out get so confused that they've run away with you already. And I think that the challenging the 350 million figure was a real object lesson in the problem that we face with politicians if they don't. It took a long time for the parliamentary committee to get to, Partygate and actually saying, to the point that Chris Mason could actually say Boris Johnson is a liar.
Last thoughts on these?
Okay. The role of the fact checker and the fact checking, that's only as good if they've got trust in the people. And I think that it's much more important for the BBC and ITV and Sky to retain and regain the trust of the British public so that people feel there is a degree of confidence in what they're listening to. And BBC has got this new thing, BBC Verify, that they've kind of, I've always, David and I would think, well, haven't we always tried to check that our stories are broadly speaking true? But let people experiment with as many ways as possible to get as much trust as you can. Honestly, and I don't know whether, it's lovely to see David here, but I mean, honestly, I spent 38, 40 years as a journalist. I've never thought there has been a more bloody awful, difficult, shitty time to be a journalist, and there's never been a more important time, because we have to counter the disinformation, the misinformation, the bad actors, the liars, the populists who would tell you that black is white. And we've got to do it in a way, and this comes to David's point about the 350 million on the side of the bus. I thought, I mean, the 350, it's when we say that 51 Nobel Prize winning economists say Brexit might be bad, but there's a bloke at Liverpool University who says it will be good, or there's a guy who runs a pub chain, I mean, who was on endlessly. And you just think, we're giving a false impression of the argument, and we're not serving the public well by doing it in that way. And I think that, look, I don't believe that any of this is easy. I mean, I think we're in the fight of our lives to retain all that is great about living in a liberal democracy, but we must never give up on it. And, we're going to have to find new ways of engaging audience. I've actually found that, I'm really heartened by the range of people who are listening to our podcast. And I hope we're doing it in a slightly different way, and we're calling things out in a way that we wouldn't be able to do in quite the bold or rude way, using swear words and things that we do on the newsagents. So I kind of think that there are things that you can do. But I think that being in a council of despair is wrong, and I think we've got to engage people on the values that we care about and why we care about them and why it's so important that they prevail. And having a public service broadcasting ecosystem that is growing good content is absolutely bloody vital.
Sophie, any last thoughts?
Yeah, I think it's really hard, the question of how you engage the public. I found it very hard for quite a long time to tell this story, because you're in the middle of a pandemic, the NHS is on its knees. The NHS has been on its knees for quite a long time. So, and I find it very difficult to explain to people why democracy, truth, accuracy in broadcasting is as important as our healthcare system, because I do feel that the NHS is more important than what we're doing. And I know that you can't really, it's not either or, is it? But it's very, very difficult to argue for this. It's a nice to have. A lot of people see having a high quality broadcasting system as a nice to have. It's the icing on the cake, but it's not the cake. And I disagree with that fundamentally, because I think that, it is the cake. But when there are other priorities that are so pressing for government, it's understandable that we get, I think we get dismissed. I think DCMS is, it's a really important department because it governs our broadcasting system and our media system, but it's not taken seriously, I don't think, by government. I don't think it's taken seriously in the system, and this is crucial. It's really crucial, but it's hard to fight for when there are other really pressing needs, such as the cost of living crisis. I mean, you name it. How are you going to fight for a rise in the BBC, in the TV licence, rising with inflation in the middle of a cost of living crisis? There we go.
Jean, I'm sorry, I have to give you two numbers, okay? So the public funding of the NHS, 131 billion. Public funding of the BBC, 2.2 billion. Okay, you can add 10% of the 3.2. It's barely around.
It's just me being oversensitive then. I mean, I just find it sometimes difficult to argue that this should be a priority, a policy priority when there are other crises.
The top of the system is probably the most important bit of this. It's about engineering the structures.
Yeah, I mean, I think you can argue for it, even though it's going to be difficult. It's difficult politically. I mean, I'd be happy if some political party wants to go into an election and say we want to get rid of the BBC and the licence fee and put that on their manifesto, and if that's what they want to get elected on. But no one ever does that. They just undermine it and continually chip away at it when they're in office and don't actually give an alternative, as I said earlier on. So what the alternative is to that, they profess a desire to have public service broadcasting, but then do everything to undermine its ability to do what its job is. I would say, you know, a couple of things. First of all, on the thing about the lie and the repetitive and the lie. I mean, you know, it was Goebbels, wasn't it? It said if you're going to tell a lie, make sure it's a big one, and that still applies, and that's why we have to be vigilant, and that's why John is absolutely right. We must never ever accept that, and we must always say and profess and ensure that we believe in the possibility of change for the better, even in the wake of powerful economic and commercial forces and, you know, malevolent political forces as well, and stand up for those values which underpin our democracy, but also underpin, you know, our public service broadcasting regime. On the issue of what are different ways in which this truth can be communicated to the public through public service broadcasting, I'm a huge fan of More or Less, for example, on Radio 4, which I think has done incredible, you know, work quietly away there to actually challenge this. When I was in government, I was briefly in charge of the Office of National Statistics, not in charge of it in that I could manipulate statistics, but they was sat in my portfolio, and we actually created something called the Statistics Authority, which was people were supposed to be able to go to and say, this minister just said, you know, this about this. What do you as the Statistics Authority say about it? And it's not used enough. They've slapped the government around a few times, but it doesn't get enough coverage actually when they do that. But I think things like, you know, programs like More or Less really perform a hugely important you know, public service in what they do, and I think it's hugely important to remember that. And finally, on this business about the Privileged Committee, yes, it may have taken some time, but don't underestimate how important what happened on Monday is to our democracy. I was able to say today in Prime Minister's questions, in opening my question, you know, let's recap. So far in this Parliament, we've had one, I said Tory, but I'll try not to be party political, but we've had one Tory Prime Minister who, it turns out, is a proven liar. I could say that today in the House of Commons because of the work of the Privileges Committee and because it's driven out you know, the former Prime Minister from Parliament, because he freely, frequently and without shame came along to Parliament and in our terminology, you know, inadvertently misled the House. No, he was lying. He was lying, and in our sort of, you know, archaic rules, we weren't allowed to say that directly in the House of Commons, but ultimately he's been held to account by that system. And that was a cross-party group of members of Parliament, including, you know, with a majority of Conservatives, doing the right thing by our democracy. And I think in terms of what we've been talking about, Trump and what, you don't underestimate how important that is, and how that, I think, constitutes a reset, you know, in Parliament in terms of, you know, going back to the notion that it's unacceptable for ministers to turn up in Parliament and to not tell the truth, and that if they do not do that and they make a mistake, they have to correct the record and put it right. And actually that allows, I think, you know, it gives more leeway, I think, to, you know, journalists like John and others to hold us all as politicians to account for what we do and say.
I just wanted to, I'd like to thank you, actually, some very interesting questions, and I'd very much like to thank the panel for a really interesting explanation. And actually, John, you know, bringing America, because it was so vivid, straight into, that's the horror show. Can we avoid it? So I'd like to thank you all very much indeed. Thank you.